Hello, I'm Julie Rodriguez-Widholm, Executive Director of the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this presentation by the noted artist, educator, author, and critic, Luis Camnitzer. Luis Camnitzer, who is Professor Emeritus of Art at the State University of New York, College of Old Westbury, is an important part of the vanguard of 1960s conceptualism. His 2007 book, Conceptualism in Latin American Art, Didactics of Liberation, is widely considered the most influential text on the subject. Among other books are New Art of Cuba, Art y Enseñanza, La Ética del Poder, on art, artists, Latin America, and other utopias, and One Number is Worth One. Camnitzer represented Uruguay in the 1988 Venice Biennale, and his artwork was featured in the 2000 Whitney Biennial and Documenta 11. Throughout his multifaceted work, Camnitzer's preoccupations include repression under systems of power, pedagogical norms, and the deconstruction of cultural presumptions. Concerns reflected in today's presentation designed to question the phenomenon of public art per se. The program is occasioned by Camnitzer's poetically minimal work currently on view at BAM-PFA as part of the museum's Art Wall Commission series, which is generously funded by Frances Hellman and Warren Breslow. Titled Below, Here, Above, Ahead Was, the project was organized by independent curator Christina Yang. 5 large vinyl stickers adhere to the wall that look like shapes of yellow-lined notepads, and under each shape is a phrase. A there that is below, a there that is here, a there that is above, a there that is ahead, a there that was. Camnitzer has stated that he doesn't really start out from materials, images, or things. Rather, he looks for problems that he finds interesting and that might affect the viewer toward independent creative thinking. He tries to produce stimuli and not self-enclosed works of art. According to Camnitzer, quote, the BAM-PFA installation constantly displaces the viewer by using a sheet of a yellow notepad. The point is that the viewer learns that displacement is in the viewer's hand and not in the hand of the artist. The real piece is what happens afterward, a viewer's secret that will never be revealed to me, end quote. I'm looking forward to this conversation, this presentation by Luis Camnitzer. And following the presentation, Camnitzer will welcome questions and comments. Please submit them via the Q&A box. Thank you, and I will turn it over to Luis.
Thank you, Julie. So I will go directly to the topic. So I believe that public art should be ephemeral and renewable. Usually it's not, and that's why I'm against most of it. I'm putting this in very dogmatic, crass, and declarative words on purpose, because I want to unpack many points. This will lead to some rambling, but part of what I want to say is in the context of an ecology of time that is controlled by its owners. Time is a property unevenly shared. In daily life, it determines how we work and how we get paid, how time is used, how it forces efficiency, how we're granted leisure time, and who can afford to waste time. In art, past time is filtered by those who administer the writing of history. The control of present time translates in the allocation of the leisure we may use to make and appreciate art. Future time is in the control of posterity through cultural gatekeeping. What concerns me here, therefore, is posterity as a way of filtering instead of enabling the future. In this context, if my work had led to a permanent installation, which would make it part of a colonization of the future, I would not have accepted this project. Fortunately, when Christine Yang, the curator who invited me, I heard her out and realized it was to be within the margins of the present. Now, happy to have accepted and having been asked to say something connected with my work, I want to explore this particular topic of ephemeral versus permanent. As an artist, the same as with a teacher, I think that success is when I'm not needed anymore. As a consequence, none of us should overstay our time. That is where public art comes in. I see public art as a manifestation of abuse of power. With its inevitability, it both invades other people's circulation space and overstays its time. Though people don't realize it, they actually fight back by getting used to it. This makes public art invisible, or when seen again, it becomes a known leftover from some past. Sometimes it's one's own past, but mostly it's somebody else's, and as we know, it may even be an offensive past. Whichever, it lingers on and occupies our present. Meanwhile, mostly without consultation, the work occupies a space that belongs to all of us. Beyond being stuck with something forever, this raises a question of satisfaction. Should the installed work satisfy the expectations of the general public, or should it be challenging? If challenging, where is the limit between challenging and being offensive? When knowledge adapts to challenge and absorbs it, should the work be declared dead and therefore removed? This, in turn, raises issues of demagoguery and conservatism. Yet, what it should raise is a discussion about the educational system, something I really won't address here because on this occasion my time is too short. Continuing with the public space then, we have that space is finite while artists are infinite. With permanence, space gets quickly clogged. And on the art side, there are too many professional artists and too many works claiming to be art. If it wouldn't sound like censorship or be used to wash history clean, one might wish there was an art sanitation service. But on what grounds would one do that? And who decides? The removal of Richard Serra's Tilted Arc was finally performed because being a circulation nuisance. From what I remember, the aesthetic wasn't discussed in depth. Circulation seemed to provide a safe objectivity that artistic quality doesn't. One of the problems is that on some levels, public art is used as a form of declarative monologue that is not only invasive, but wears out. Even if non-narrative, somebody is visually talking to us, trying to instill values without us being able to make them shut up or to respond. Imagine having Shakespeare in the middle of a square, incessantly reading his work. Visualize him standing on a monument-like platform. After a while, he probably would be toppled regardless quality. It would be because of being obnoxious. On this, our oral patience may be much shorter than our visual one. More radically, in discussing visual artifacts, I will also include buildings. There is, of course, a blurry line that allows us to believe that architecture is a different species of sculpture or special installations. But if we don't enter the buildings and look at them as sculptures, there is no separation line. I therefore include architecture in public art. I accept that it would be impractical if architecture was ephemeral. The usefulness of tents is very limited. But architecture should take responsibility not only for what and how it expresses egos, but also for a lifestyle guided by economics and not by cultural contribution. So, I should now confess that though I finally settled in art, I also studied architecture. I dropped out 1 year before graduation after a deciding epiphany. I was looking at the manicured garden of the modernist landmark building of our school in Uruguay. The architect, Roman Fresnedosiri, a very good one by 1950 standards, had carefully laid flagstones on the lawn to mark the path we should walk. During 4 years, I never had paid attention to it until that particular moment. There was a crisscross pattern of alternative paths that showed where people, real life people, walked. The students read the flagstones as "keep off the grass" signs and ignored them. The pattern was a map of consensus. It showed where the flagstones should have been, and had the architect decided on dialogue instead of monologue, he would have waited to find that out before laying down the stones. Seeing this so clearly, I wondered, what the hell am I doing here? I shouldn't be imposing spaces on people. I should help them think about them on their own. I did not pack and leave on the spot, but I started my severance. And even more importantly, this further embedded the educational outlook in my art thinking and making. Aside from the arrogance involved, the architect's task was an easy one. The problem of getting from here to there was solved by us. He only had to deal with the rest. For circulation, it was safe to assume that there was one single public to contend with. No differences in education, social class, languages, or ethnicity. And yet, the architect was still able to mess things up. I don't know if he ever faced any of this. Fresnedo passed away a decade after my insight, but I never met him to tell my story. He might have claimed defensively that we had vandalized his garden. That would be true if the garden had been his, but in reality it was ours. Vandalizing was a way of showing that it was ours. It was a way of forcing him into a dialogue that never took place. The use of the word vandalizing is very interesting. I looked it up, found that originally it was used to badmouth a group of people that took stuff from Rome while invading it during the 5th century. The Vandals infringed the property rights of a group that saw itself as dominant and righteous. Rome was culturally strong enough to make the negativity of the word stick until today. By now, it has stopped being an ethnic slur. Instead, it shifted to reaffirm the untouchability of the ownership of property. Our society is built around this. We condemn stealing and build hostile architecture, but we also extend these ideas in general. Plagiarism, a way of increasing the circulation of ideas, is illegal and punishable. Copyright laws are magic. They transmute ideas into objects. I'm raising these divergent points not to undo the system, but to ensure that certain ideas and facts are discussed rather than being taken for granted or used hypocritically. Public art is only public because it is set in continually used public spaces. However, if I sit on a bench in a park and eat a sandwich, that doesn't make it a public sandwich. That means that some convincing took place without us noticing. In the case of museums, if I can afford the ticket, I at least have the freedom to choose if I want to go or not. In a public space, one has to see what is presented without the chance of escape. Each time you walk up or down the stairs here in the museum, you have to decide if you close your eyes and risk tripping or if you look at my work. Public space is our space. However, it is expected that we should be grateful for what is brought into it. No matter what it is, this raises the issue of the paternalist concept of art for the people, a way of expanding the consumption base and the acceptance of the canon. If society would really be interested in this, it would have a different educational system. Rather than focus on STEM, it would integrate creation methods into the process. Then, by the time we get to the canon, we can challenge and develop it collectively. In fact, this is not just about art. Any communication has an educational component, even if we only want to communicate how we want to be perceived. We educate our audience with the way we dress, we talk, and how we present ourselves. It may not be art, but it certainly tries to manipulate public perception. This makes vanity, no matter what we think about it or what shape it takes, into another educational tool. Exhibition and exhibitionism are therefore dangerously related. Permanent public art reflects vanity and tries to educate accordingly. Public art does not close a cultural gap because somebody gives the art and somebody receives it. The erasure of the gap is both a political issue and an educational one. So, now, in regard to my wall piece that prompted this text, if it was to be a permanent installation in what here is a public space, the question would be, why my work? If ephemeral, this question doesn't matter, or at least matters less. The piece would be gone soon anyway, and will leave room for another artist. If permanent, we are imposing somebody's opinions onto a long future. If ephemeral, we're allowing the present to keep challenging and expressing itself over and over. I find this difference between both very important. It's not only about the lifespan of the artwork, but also about how I see myself as an artist. The first case, we're operating within an opinionated structure that for many reasons ranges from vanity and profit to utopian idealism. It tries to declare and set down a series of values. It assumes that for whatever reason, my aesthetic format is worth conserving, if nothing else, for archaeological reasons. In ephemerality, it is the awareness that I belong to a particular group of people that is defined by the present. Within this present, I'm helping do the best we can. In real life, both positions do not exclude each other, but at least for me, it's useful to have some clarity. Given the infinity of available artists, it is very difficult to have access to the limited real estate available for art. To achieve entry involves somebody's exercise in power, and power shouldn't be taken lightly. The distribution of power places us in society with some precision. It forces us to decide if we submit or rebel to the placement. Power affects what impact our choices may have on the rest of the flock. It decides if what we do is a simple declaration or if it has more impact as a perturbation. In the ways most of art functions today as a declaration, we hope that it's attributed to our authorship. We want both the declaration and us as authors to stay in everybody's memory for as long as possible. However, if it's a perturbation, we hope that it unleashes a process owned and evolved by the collective. There, we don't matter as authors anymore. In fact, as long as we remain recognized as authors, we slow down or impede the process of change. The work is taken and remains as a hostage in a name. A recent study about collective response and collective behavior pointed out that there is a difference between consensus or collective order and responsiveness. The study proposes that it's not consensus, but the degree of responsiveness what actually defines collective behavior. Consensus in this is a passive reaction, while responsiveness is an active consequence. The study identifies the importance of certain forms of leadership used to achieve changes in behavior. It doesn't mean simple authoritarian power applied by leaders, but the actions by which the study calls stubborn agents. Their input may be accepted, ignored, or rejected, but it's there nevertheless. In biological groups like flocks of birds, these agents quote, react to some external perturbation within the environment and informs the group. After identifying food sources and predators, they provide, quote again, a gateway to injecting local perturbations in the emergent collective behavior. The study brought to my mind the role of artists and progressive educators when, in Western culture, they assume their role as transformative cultural agents. As artists and educators, we too might be defined as stubborn agents who inject perturbations in the collective behavior. Collective behavior or responsiveness and consensus then absorbs these perturbations. This may be done either constructively or by minimizing effects through rejection or cooptation. In either case, the final result is an invisibility that challenges us and makes us devise new ways to perturb. One of our obstacles as artists is that we're trained to focus on and reach a consensus concerning our own importance. However, for those artists that are more socially aware, we want to affect the consensus related to knowledge and not the one about ourselves. To achieve this, most of art production addresses issues of denotation, that is, of coding meanings in new ways that help processing and expanding knowledge. This aim started to peak more overtly when Paul Klee used poetic titles to redirect his images, and when Marcel Duchamp and René Magritte directly addressed signification. Then, picked up by conceptual art, for some artists, the notation was not enough. To unleash responsiveness over consensus, they focused on detonation. It's amazing how just shifting 2 letters can introduce radical ideological changes. In practical terms, though, both denotation and detonation may coexist. Many works concerned with revealing meaning go beyond to continue the life in those who sees it. Detonation, however, is not endless. It is kept in bounds by moving from centrifugal explosion into self-contained and valuable icons. This preserves stability by making perturbations part of the established order and consensus. Life then proceeds as normal, waiting for the appearance of the next batch of upheaval. While artists as well as educators try to introduce perturbations, the situation among people is a little more complex than among birds. Of course, anybody may introduce perturbations. That is a right I'm advocating for. But in our society, we have the cultural and non-cultural industries also act as stubborn agents. This then creates a conflict. As an example, the Texas Energy Council managed in recent years to remove criticism of fossil energy's effects on global warming from any Texas textbooks. Focus shifted to cost benefits instead. The decision of the state, one of the largest buyers of textbooks in the US, therefore also affects the content of national textbooks as well. But even worse, art and general education eventually become part of these industries. In the form of fashions, they are then used to manipulate both opinion and needs in their favor. By the time perturbations enter consensus, they have lost one of the few cultural advantage authorship has, some degree of accountability. Stubborn agents are only identifiable at the starting point. Afterwards, their contribution becomes anonymous unless refreshed by new contributions. Therefore, authorship is by nature ephemeral and only kept alive by artificial life support. Depending on one's point of view, having authorship being ephemeral is not a bad thing. When the name of the author survives, usually aided by art history, intellectual history, prices, and copyright laws, this is something minor. What matters is the effect of the work and how it integrates into collective culture. While it may be interesting to know details and gossip about Leonardo da Vinci or about Albert Einstein, it is their achievements in perturbing and shaping consensus what leaves the mark. Without trying to diminish their stature, it's clear that their authorship only was important as a starting point. Authorship sometimes stays on after the work stops being relevant. This proves that work and authorships belong to two different categories, only fused by market requirements. Nobody knows who invented the wheel. Few people know that the originally odd-shaped Coca-Cola bottle was designed in 1915 by a Swede named Alexander Samuelsson. Outmoded art, and even more outmoded public art, means that its active role ceased. The work is downgraded to the dated documents of times past collection. There, as documents, it doesn't matter anymore what levels of quality they have or what canon they obey. This is the reason why I would prefer not to have my work in that folder. It also is why I'm against demolishing existing monuments and public art. Their demolition is akin to book burning. In this case, it is a way of cleaning and rewriting history. Access to previously committed sins and crimes has to be kept so we can analyze, correct, and not repeat them. This then brings us to the importance of the placement and time. What is being placed and where? It also brings me back to the ephemeral versus the permanent. More pointedly, to where I would want to have my work placed, particularly when the issue is this installation in this museum. I understand that one of the several functions of a museum is to act as part of artists' life support equipment. Although we don't know exactly how they do it, at some point museums declare particular works of art as brain dead. They disconnect them from the system and bury them in the basement morgue, to then scatter the bodies by deaccession. That is not exactly the shape of posterity envisioned by living artists. Personally, I don't believe much in posterity, so it doesn't matter. Even within the limited space of a family, posterity is something that slowly fades away. However, I do care what happens with the public in the present. I'm a member of that public, and though a misanthrope, I have some of the shared responsibilities members have or should have. However, the term public is as vague as people or humankind, or as birds for the different flocks of birds. Stubborn agents act as such within a specific flock and not for all bird kind. Public, therefore, is subdivided into an infinity of publics, and when we use the general term, there are two possibilities. One is that we look for the most general and basic common denominator to accommodate everybody. The other is that one segment of the public, that small group or part of the flock that is in power, dictates what should be seen and appreciated by the rest and defines what posterity should look like. That group will try to shape the future according to its own interests, which not always matches the interests of the other publics. In all this, the ephemerality of art may not be much more than an attempt to reach the lesser evil by minimizing harm. Accordingly, I believe that the production of art objects is much less important than what they try to make us believe. Ultimately, art objects, as much the tangible ones as those presented in the expanded version of art situations, are only stimuli. They help people move in some direction. Unfortunately, most of the history of art is an enhanced history of crafts and not one of the moves. Still, some of the recorded pieces manage to transcend the prison of the material in the making. They have the added small component that actually makes them into art. It's a part that today we call making meanings. From the broader point of view of the placement of matter in the universe, working in crafts means moving materials from one place to another. From an art point of view, the important part is not how everything looks after the move or the quality of the finish, but what happens afterwards. That is, what new meanings are generated by the move and how relevant are they for the job. These meanings happen in the exploration of things unknown, but we don't even know what is unknown and to whom it is unknown. The importance of the exploration, therefore, is contingent on the segment of the public that is being addressed, on the references, and on the tacit understandings they share. Whatever is unknown in the moment we define as present, once it is known, is shifted into the past. In art, the same as in science, we work trying to formulate interesting problems and solve them as best as we can. Science, however, is limited in the way it works. Everything has to be reasoned, provable, and steps have to be retraceable. Whatever mystery there is has to be erased. While art may use the repertoire of science, it expands it into the unexplainable and the unpredictable for as long as it lasts, without needing an explanation. Therefore, mystery is to be kept. Yet, this is a secular activity because the same as with science, it's our power and our actions that are at work. In her The Books of Jacob, Polish writer Olga Tokarczuk, as a rabbinical student, explained theological dilemmas. He says that in order to create the world, God had to, quote, withdraw from himself, leave within his body a blank place in which the world could take up residence. The world was able to arise solely because God was not in it. First there was something, and then that something was gone. That is the world. The world then, in its entirety, is lack. End of quote. Everything and everybody, including atheists like myself, may occupy this void. I believe it is here where science and art fuse into each other. Science wants to know why that void exists, and as soon as possible, be done with the question. Art, though accepting the importance of that search, is interested in finding different ways to fill it. As artists, we know that it won't ever happen, that we never will fill that void. We know we're dealing with the mystery of infinity, and we're enjoying it. We're hoping to teach others to navigate it without reaching to the dogmas and hermeticism of religion. If a mystery is solved, that information briefly stays part of the present, but then recedes into the past. We know that there always is another mystery behind it. It is those that determine the future and maintain the void going. I would rather pay attention to these matters than to particular objects and their survival, even if they are mine. To be honest, my work is much humbler. I don't believe that my installation at the museum delves too deeply in mystery or fills anything. It merely tries to show how a plain and overlooked object, like a sheet from a yellow notepad, is mysterious in itself. It has the surprising power to define our position without touching us. It relates to my puzzlement of why, in traditional still lifes, objects have to keep their shapes and symmetries without reacting to the background or to each other. Things are depicted in isolation, and when from their solitude they attempt a dialogue among themselves, it is generally through a storyline. Shape is made permanent by the immutable outlines defined by the conventions of drawing, making communication stilted. When objects finally do communicate, they are not allowed to use their own gestures, and things are not allowed to talk to us. If they ever do, or if we talk to them, we're not seen as trying to fill the void. We're just called crazy. However, pointing out that impossibility, though not solvable, is both conceivable and to be respected, that is one of our modest but important tasks. Therefore, ephemeral examples of art, even with a lasting effect of no more than a few seconds, may help others to broaden thinking and perceptions. Many artworks become invisible by taking the shape of commonplaces, but they may still be of some use. They can challenge us to respond and produce new ones to take their place. It is in this that they may have some relevance. In the Sisyphus-like life of the artist, we have to keep respecting the void while making it look like we're trying to fill it. That is only that intangible act all we can honestly share and hope that it survives the passage of time. Thank you. So I guess now we are in the question and answer period. Okay, here I have a question of what form do I imagine museums taking in the future, at least during our lifetimes. I don't know exactly. The museums are not very responsive. We're now like 30 years after the educational turn started for art institutions, and there has been some change. There's been, fortunately, new generations that have come in, but it's not a radical change. Museums are still protecting the canon instead of asking people to challenge it and maybe find a new canon, or confirm it at least. There's still the divide between production and consumption. Museums are not erasing it. Museums are not yet reaching out to join the educational process in schools from the very beginning. They're expecting people to walk into the building rather than the museum walking out of the building. And then we have confinement by COVID and whatever comes after. And the classic reaction to COVID by MoMA was to fire educational teams rather than revise educational strategy. But at some point, museums may be like libraries and be threatened the same as libraries are threatened by Kindle, threatened by virtual, not by virtual reproductions of art, which is a diminished version, and so shifting ostentation from the building to a book or to a screen, but starting, and the burden is on us, particularly on the next generation, not on mine, of starting to work on art that that stem from and work in the virtual realm. So I have great faith on memes. And once there are memes as an interactive, creative, anonymous tool, and serious work is done on that, maybe museums will recede to just be a place of reference and nothing else. So, Claire Frost is curious to see my practice as a perturbation. I think you're seeing it in this moment. That's how far I can go. And Robin Ballinger, can you please say more about being against monument removal? And if a monument is vandalized, is that a contemporary perturbation? Well, I think if vandalization is interpreted not as a destruction of private property or public property, instead is analyzed as communication, then you realize that it's a sort of, yes, violent reaction to an interrupted or forbidden dialogue. And therefore it has to be respected and dealt with. In the case of monuments, I think every monument that is erected in favor of some genocidal criminal, which most monuments are, there should be not taken away of the monument, but an area in which people can update the views about that criminal and update the history so that you know what you're looking at instead of looking at false glorification. And that's an educational process that I find very important, that has not been taken care of yet, and I hope it will. It's interesting that the Museum of, I guess, Museum of Slavery in Liverpool, I don't remember the title of the museum, has a reproduction of all the street signs in Liverpool that honor the slave trader. So you have a reproduction of the plate on the wall, and you lift the plate, and you have the biography of the person's crimes. And I think that's a nice way of handling the problem. There's another question here. Okay, can you talk a little bit about your understanding of the idea of ambiguity? It seems like the word public is too vague and therefore not satisfying to you. But if we were to think about public art as a trace of the passage of time, many temporal details are also abbreviated or rendered ambiguous. Do you find that unsatisfying? Yes, I do. I think in that sense, public art either tries to instill a value of the power structure or tries to figure out an average level of consumption. And I don't know what the solution is to that. I mean, I don't like either, and I also wouldn't like little areas that are directed, like making little ghettos in the public park. That doesn't make much sense either. So that's why I think public art is not a good solution, period. Unless it leaves quickly. It's installed and leaves, which some actually does. I think one of the big tasks of an artist is to identify whom the artist is talking to. And we often make the mistake of lumping public into one general work and some general audience, which ultimately is merely the small fraction, the elitist fraction that goes to a gallery or to a museum. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't address that public, because that public is usually the one that is more affluent and has more power and needs more education to exercise their power correctly. But there's an arrogance in believing that that segment is the public. So being sort of an exile, I face that very strongly. What is my public? And I never was at ease with assimilating to the US public, although I'm living here for over half a century. And I'm still addressing my original public, which is the intellectual class of Uruguay of the late 50s and early 60s, which is a group of people that unfortunately probably is all dead by now. And still I'm talking to them. And that's a problem of exile, that you end up in limbo in terms that you talk to people, to ghosts, ultimately. And that doesn't mean that what you're doing is invalid for anybody else. It just means that that public that understands you 100% because it shares your tacit understandings, that public is a very defined public. And then this public close by that will understand you only 90%, and other public further away 80%, and so on. And the further it is culturally, the less percentage will stay in the communication circuit. And that's something that art as a universal language tries to ignore, and therefore becomes a merchandising technique to a large market, and assume that art is a global, international language that everybody understands. And if you don't, you're just not sophisticated enough or cultural enough to do that. And eventually you will, through marketing, understand it. But you won't. You won't, because there's always, even if there's an international language, there are always dialects that take care of local tacit understandings. And the dialect is made up for 100% understanding, and not the 90, 80, or 70%, which at the other extreme becomes an ideological way of looking at things, in which you don't have a clue what the object is telling you, and you start projecting your own imagination onto it. There's nothing wrong with that, but at least we should be aware what we're doing. So I don't know if that answers Ivy. And Prayati. Are there ways that artists can suspend their egos and still make effective public art? I think it's a tough one, because if you decide to make public art, there is an ego involved. So I don't know how to answer that. But I think artists should suspend their egos even if they don't do public art. Not somehow I feel ego art is outmoded and not very useful. It's good for venting, but not very good for society. And it's time that we start thinking of the common good and not of ourselves. So now Ivy is back, asking how would you navigate the in-between space between accuracy and ambiguity? Okay, accuracy has a danger of being declarative. And ambiguity, when it goes overboard, becomes meaningless or just open to projection. So what we're talking about is about controlled ambiguity. That is, instead of having a linear communication, the artist communicates within an angle in which you don't want the viewer to go beyond the borders of that angle. But in the surface of that angle, you want the viewer to be able to go nuts, to do whatever they want, which means it's a controlled freedom, but it's freedom. And it's also manipulation. If you are making or thinking of opposing the war, if you just make an accurate statement, I am against the war, the only thing you're doing is informing people about your opinion, which is totally uninteresting and irrelevant and doesn't do much. And even if it does something, it does it for the wrong reasons. So as an artist with a political bent, what you really want is that the viewer reaches the conclusion you want the viewer to reach, but on their own, or at least believing that it happens on their own. So art is manipulative, like advertising is in any other communication. You want to be understood in certain ways. Therefore, you intonate, you raise your voice or don't raise your voice, you manipulate, you move your hands and so on to convince in the angle you want to convince. And therefore you are manipulating the listener or the viewer. So how do you do that? And that's what we're discussing here. If it's accurate, it's a yes or no situation. It's one solution to a problem without room for other solutions or without room for the viewer to discover something. So you want discovery to be part of the communication, but you want that discovery to be within the margins of your own interests. And that is not easy, and that requires a lot of thought, a lot of responsibility, a lot of controlling arrogance and your own power, and be sure that the power ultimately is in the viewer. I cannot tell you much more than that, at least not in a short answer. Okay, this one is thanking, which at this point we don't need. Okay, this is nobody else. Then thank you very much. It was a pleasure, although I didn't hear you. And I left your word on board. Okay, so goodbye and thank you.